Hi, it's Roz, and I am having such a wonderful October reading things for Victober. So I'm back with the second short Victober video, and this one is about the thing that I've been reading in response to Kate Howe's prompt, which was to read something new to you by a Victorian author who's a favourite. And I love the novels of Thomas Hardy. He is a favourite Victorian author for me. But although I'm familiar with some of his poetry, The Darkling Thrush has always been a favourite poem of mine. I must have read it in an anthology as a child, and it's one that's always sort of stayed in my mind and that I go back to. But for someone who considers himself a poet first and foremost, not a novelist, I really haven't done justice to his poetry. So I thought I would read an actual collection of his, and this is it. It's Thomas Hardy selected shorter poems chosen and introduced by John Wayne, and it's not a recent collection. This was actually published in first published in 1966 as a collection, and I think I got this edition sometime in the 1990s, and it's sat on my shelf, and I've dipped into it, but I've never read the whole thing from cover to cover. So thank you, Kate, for your prompt, because it got me to read it properly. Now, if you've read any Hardy, you will know that he's not a cheery writer, let's face it. Most of his novels have a kind of tragic quality, or, almost like that, the kind of archetypal Greek tragedy, where you see someone's fall through, and much as they try and things become more hopeful, ultimately it just goes downhill, and the inevitable tragic ending comes, and he revels in that a bit. Yeah, he's a bit miserabilist, I suppose. Whatever you do, if you haven't read any Hardy yet, don't start with Jude the Obscure, because you probably never pick up another one, because it is one of the most miserable books ever. Beautiful and wonderful, but oh god, dear. Yeah. So then probably the exception to that rule amongst his novels that I've read is Under the Greenwood Tree. But what that has in bundles is his other tendency, which is to kind of look back at the past very sort of nostalgically, so with a regret, so a feeling that things are generally going downhill compared with a lovelier past. So that kind of obsession with sadness, bereavement, death, loss, regret, nostalgia, that you get loads of that in these poetry. There isn't really a kind of a chipper, cheery poem in this book, let's face it. Did I mind? No, I loved it. It was wonderful. Obviously, I'm masochistic enough to like being brought to the verge of tears by poem after poem about loss and bereavement or whatever. It really, yeah. I can't believe I've never read in an extended way Hardy's poetry before. I think I probably like the fact that these are shorter poems. I should have a go at some of his longer poems as well, but there's a kind of Victorian longer poem thing that doesn't always go so well for me, and so I think this was the right selection to read. Now, yes, they're very moving, but they don't fall into that kind of classic Victorian kind of, I don't know, piety thing. I think actually he may have been an atheist, but couldn't really say that at the time. He when he writes about loss and death, he doesn't do the, oh, but it's right because they're in heaven now. In contrast, say, with Tennyson's In Memoriam, where it's got quite a kind of religious bent. He doesn't, and perhaps that appealed to me. Yeah, even though it was unhopeful, if that makes sense. one of the things that I love about his novels is the very, very powerful sense of place that you get in all his books. He writes about this sort of fictionalized area he Wessex, but that it's all places that I recognise, that I've been to in Dorset and Hampshire and Devon and Wiltshire. They're recognisable places, and they imbue his stories that feeling of that place. In the poetry, what you get, in a kind of related way, I suppose, is his, I think, quite intense and special connection with nature. It comes up again and again, and that brings some very arresting images in some of the poems. I'll give you just 2 lines here from a poem called The Prospect that he wrote in 1912. The twigs of the birch imprint the December sky like branching veins upon a thin old hand. Great, isn't it? Isn't that gorgeous? Yeah. He in some of the poems he kind of comes over, I suppose, as someone who likes to wants to be seen as someone who's sensitive to that physical, natural world around him. Another very short bit I'm going to read you from a poem called Afterwards, and I really love the whole poem, and I made link to like something on the if I can't find it on like Poetry Foundation or something, a free place where you can read it. I will link to it. But here's the first verse. When the present has latched its postern behind my tremulous stay, and the May month flaps its glad green leaves like wings, delicate filmed as new-spun silk, will the neighbours say, he was a man who used to notice such things? It's those leaves that got me, leaves in May, like when beech tree leaves first come out, and they absolutely are delicate filmed as new-spun silk. Yeah, that's magic description, yeah. And I'd like to be someone who remembered as someone who noticed such things, yeah, as the beauty of a beech leaf in spring. He takes some comfort in nature, I think. He doesn't take comfort in religion, but he does take comfort in nature. And I think some of his lovely poems in here about death, loss, various poems set in graveyards. I'm going to make this sound much more morbid. Well, it is morbid, I guess, but more morbid than it is. But he takes comfort, I think, in the thought that after our death we're somehow reincorporated with nature. And to illustrate this, I'm going to give you the last verse from a poem called Rain on a Grave. It's one that he wrote after the death of his wife. So it's actually a post-Victorian poem, but he's definitely a Victorian writer, I think. So I feel allowed. Okay, he started writing poetry in the 1860s, for goodness sake. Okay, so this poem talks sadly about it. Yeah, he's looking at her grave. It's raining. He's thinking about their time together, summer showers and thunderclouds, and if only that they were together again. In the last verse, he imagines her somehow being imbued into the daisies that grow on her grave, and takes joy in that because daisies were a joy to her. You'll see what I mean. Soon will be growing green blades from her mound, and daisies be showing like stars on the ground, till she form part of them, aye, the sweet heart of them, loved beyond measure with a child's pleasure all her life's round. So on that slightly more sort of cheerful and hopeful note, I will stop. But tell me if you've read Hardy's poetry and if you enjoy it, or which is your favourite Victorian poet.